One of the things my show has always been about, or rather, one of the things I've always tried to make this about, is a degree of positivity. That phrase I keep using, games are awesome, let's discuss, discuss, isn't just a catchphrase. It's not just something I say because it looks good on a poster or a t-shirt or whatever. I say it because I mean it. Because as someone who has experience with so many different aspects of life and so many different types of things that people are interested in, this is one of those few elements that I am truly well versed in enough that I can talk with and with other people about at length, that I can talk about it at length, that I can really go in depth on and say, here's awesome, let me really go into why it's awesome, right? It's one of those things I enjoy doing. But overall, the intent has always been to be net positive, as I like to call it. You'll forgive me if I'm searching for words, and I'll get to why in just a moment. Because one of the other things I try to do on this show is to be myself, as much as I'm capable of being. Yes, obviously you're not seeing the real me here, because, that's virtually an impossibility, nor indeed is there actually such a thing if you really get down to it. But that's philosophical talk for another time. My point in this is that I try very hard to be as much myself as I can for these videos so that you see as much of me as I can, because that's one of the atmospheres I'm going for, that personable, hey, let's talk about this thing and let's just kind of chat about it, and here, let me really go into detail about it. And one of those things I want to do is to enthuse, and I want to be fair to some extent, but not to a full extent. In other words, while I try to discuss, for example, the downsides of a game or the negative parts of a game, I try to do so without really ranting or raving about it, is really what I'm trying to get to. I want to tell you, yes, I think Morrowind is the best Elder Scrolls ever made. And by the way, if I haven't made that clear, I think Morrowind is the best Elder Scrolls ever made. In fact, arguably one of my favorite games of all time. But there are some problems with it. There are some difficulties with the thing. Most of these can be fixed by mods, as I've mentioned before. But the fact is, I want you to be aware of those problems, just in case you go to that game thinking it's going to be, ascended down from on high or whatever, and you encounter all those problems. No, I want you to go in with eyes wide open. But I don't try. What I try not to do is to be like, Morrowind has this problem and it's terrible, and I can't even do this mockingly properly right now. I apologize. I want to just talk about this a little bit, if it's okay with you. I really need to get this off my chest. That's basically why I'm doing this video. I plan on doing another video tonight, whenever I'll upload these, I don't know, but in order to compensate, to get an actual rumination out instead of just me ranting here, so that you guys can actually have a real video instead of just me talking like I'm about to do. I am of a weird age group, I've often said. I tend to think of it as the perfect age group to get a little bit of everything. Now, let me try and explain that a little bit. I was alive during the Cold War. I watched The Wall Fell on my TV in my tiny little living room. I understood significance of the events of that time and some of the mentalities and eras of that time, I wasn't actually alive in that time, though. Or let me rephrase it. Obviously, I was alive during the Cold War. But I was alive towards the end of the Cold War. I was not born in the 60s, if you follow me here. So I only get a bit of that time frame. I only get a bit of that culture, a bit of that history in my life. By the same token, I am sufficiently past, in my own mentality. Let me put this properly, because I don't want to make it sound like I'm better than you. No. I am so set in my ways now, because I've become who I am over the last many, many years, that nowadays I don't get into the things other people do. For example, one of the things I like to use as my best example of this is I don't internet. Now, most of you out there probably know exactly what I mean when I say that. I don't just randomly browse the web. I don't go to Tumblr is one of the sites, or I don't use Facebook, anything like that. I don't do that. I don't web. I don't internet. It's not something I'm into. It's not something I enjoy. When I use the internet, I'm using it for a specific purpose. I need to look up blah, or I need to do blah, and I'll do blah, And I know the irony of that for having a YouTube channel, but the point does actually remain. I'm not actually a part of this generation. I just share a little bit of it, a little bit of its mentality, and it goes in both directions. I feel like this lends me a weird perspective sometimes, and I find myself unable to adequately explain it. I was actually trying to explain it to a friend of mine just earlier today. because I've been talking about this all day. I really have. With every single one of my friends, I've been talking about this. I kind of feel bad for them. I do apologize for any of you guys who watch this for yakking your ears off about this subject. I was alive when Old Who, as I like to call it now, was still out. And I grew up watching a great deal of reruns and replays of old Who, and Old Who in general. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, there is a show called Doctor Who, which originated in the UK on the BBC, which is rather popular. Was rather popular for that matter. They had some good times, they had some bad times, they had some awful times. But by and large, it was a good show, and I really enjoyed it. And then Doctor Who kind of went away. Now, yes, there was that little movie miniseries. I'm barely even, or not miniseries, but you know what I'm talking about. The Eighth Doctor. I'm barely even counting that. For a long time, there was no Who, and there was no real. There's going to be any new Who. There was just this period of time at which there was not going to be Doctor Who for a while, and there was no hope of it coming back. That feeling is one of those things that I'm trying to convey here with this video in its entirety. All of this video is ultimately about that feeling right there. Something that I enjoyed, something I dare say I loved, has gone away. And probably isn't coming back. Now, as those of you out there know, Doctor Who came back. They did New Who with the Ninth Doctor with Eccleston, and it accomplished the impossible. It was actually good. Now, I say that because even though I do think of myself as an idealist and an optimist, I have to admit I have a very cynical tint when it comes to things like that. Whenever I am first introduced to something that is coming back, or is that a remake of, or a reboot of, or whatever, my initial thought is it's going to be horrible, because I've seen that happen so many times before. This is not a new thing. People talk about us recycling ideas and stuff in movies. The only thing that's changed is that we've gotten more blatant about it. This is not a new concept, so usually when I look at something like that, I think this is going to be terrible, right? I was very pleasantly surprised by New Who. I really enjoyed it. Props to them for pulling that off. It's still going. My God, man, So definite good vibes there, and that really. Well, let me get to my point. I've been giving you enough backstory. There are three major franchises I want to talk about in specific. I mean, there's others I could bring up. For example, any of you out there remember Breath of Fire? Because I do. Now, Breath of Fire isn't exactly that old, but it is old enough at this point that most people I know who are recent gamers or young gamers have never even heard of it. And then something about that kind of bothers me a little bit, because this. I'll talk about that in a minute. But here's another gun. This is one I know you've heard of. It's called Megaman. Now, for those of you out there who've been really following the news and really keep up on gaming information and what happened with Inafune and the fallout with Capcom, know that Mega Man is basically over. We have lost Mega Man, and there is no real news or hint whatsoever that Mega Man is coming back at all. And I think that's sad. I think that's tragic, to be honest with you, because, well, let's go to another one before I get to my because. The Seiken Densetsu series. For those of you who aren't as big a geeks as I am, the Sword of Mana, or the Secret of Mana series. Some of those games, well, at least two of those games, still haven't come out outside of Japan, legitimately. But I really enjoyed basically all of the games of that series, except for the little strategy game on the GBA, or I'm sorry, the DS. I didn't really care for that one that much, but overall, some really good games, all things considered. And that series has also just kind of stopped. Here's the problem. Here's the because. It is my opinion that most franchises do have to end at some point, or basically start over. One of these two things. For example, Battlestar Galactica, it has been argued, and I want to stress, this is purely my opinion as well, okay, that the Battlestar Galactica old series probably should have ended, not actually when it did, but a little bit after that. It should have kept going a little bit further to really finalize things, and then been done. But then they did the new Battlestar Galactica, which was a totally new thing. The franchise kept going, but it was something new. You follow me here? It is possible to do this. We have seen this happen before. It has been successfully done more than once. So, at a certain point, most franchises should end and either stop forever or be renewed. Actually, Doctor Who is probably a pretty good example of that. New Who is effectively New Who. I mean, yes, it is still the same canon. You get where I'm going with this. I don't have to elaborate. You're smart enough to figure out what I'm talking about here. So Breath of Fire, the Seiken Densetsu, and the Mega Man series all weren't ready to end yet. In fact, not to spoil anything out there, but for any of you who haven't played Mega Man the ZX series, the two games on the DS, the most recent one, Advent, literally ends on a cliffhanger and a setup for the next game. It's like, we're ready. And it's like ZX and ZX2 both were built up to the third game that we were all waiting for that at this point is never coming out. And the Secret of Mana series was primed to really start going somewhere, and that just everything just kind of fell out of that one. And the Breath of Fire series kind of petered off after 5, or I'm sorry, during 5, admittedly, but Breath of Fire 1, 2, 3, and 4, in my opinion, are all good games, especially 2. But the three big examples I wanted to get out here, because I could list examples all day, I really could, are Star Trek and Star Wars, and of course the main one here, Final Fantasy. Now, I mentioned Star Trek and Star Wars first because I want to talk about the relation of the concept of the franchise going through this pattern. It's here, and then it kind of settles for a bit, and then it suddenly experiences a rise, some inexplicable period of time after it already is out and came out, and it becomes really popular, and it gets really widespread, and it becomes a huge deal, and it becomes a true multinational franchise, and then it starts to peter out for a second, and then it just kind of plummets, more or less out of nowhere. It just bottoms up. And it stays in the bottom of the gutter. Now, what happens after this point tends to vary. And I say that because we actually aren't finished with this pattern yet in any of these three cases. Say what you will about Nemesis and Enterprise, both of these things, this is not conjecture, both of these things killed the Star Trek franchise. Paramount and the other company whose name I can't think of right now basically decided it's over. We're pulling the plug on Star Trek, and we're not even going to try it again for some time. And it took many years for Abrams' film to come out in 2009. So Star Trek stopped, and for a long time there was no real hope of there being a new Star Trek for many years. And then they started this new movie, and that did well enough that now that we've got the second movie. Now this is the pattern Star Trek is following. We have hope now as Trekkers. We hope that this second movie will be good, first of all, but more importantly will be viable. Star Trek 4, way back in the day, is the reason we have Star Trek nowadays. Now you can argue that left and right or whatever, but again, this is not something that I'm saying as a matter of opinion. The math and the backing of the numbers, the financial success of Star Trek 4 is what proved that Star Trek could be a viable franchise for some time. Star Trek 2 is the reason we got Star Trek 4. I'm not arguing that, because Star Trek was actually going to go down the tubes if Star Trek 2 hadn't done well. So Star Trek 2 also gave us the modern era. But Star Trek 4 was the big success story. It's the one that made all the money, made it more common, made it more popular, and did incredibly well and helped get TNG really going. You know, almost everything we have about Star Trek nowadays came from, more or less directly, Star Trek 4, right? That's what a lot of us are hoping the new Star Trek is going to be. Another success story that's going to help us keep this franchise going, even if it's in a new format, even if it's in the future, whatever. There is some manner in which we want this to keep going. Like I said, just because it doesn't have to continue the same old stuff like Battlestar Galactica didn't, and several other examples haven't. As long as it's good, you know, as long as it keeps going. Star Wars. I don't think I have to tell most of my viewers how Star Wars bottomed out. In my personal opinion, just my opinion, Force Unleashed 2 was the bottom of the barrel for Star Wars. Now you could argue certain other specific things like the Jar Jar Binks blow pop thing that was ridiculous and stupid and horrifying, but in my opinion, as far as major elements, Force Unleashed 2 was the real bottoming out point. Yes, the game was still fun to play, I'm not arguing that. But it was so much of a slap in the face to so many Star Wars fans, and it was so clear that it was being done specifically and explicitly to wring money out of what it was believed to be a failing franchise. Because that's what companies do when franchises are starting to go downhill. They try to wring the money out of it before they give up on it. This is not new. Again, this is not something unique. And the fact that it's Star Wars doesn't mean it gets special dispensation from anybody in charge of the money, you know? They still have to pay the bills. They still have to justify themselves to the board of directors, you know, blah, blah, blah. This is life. It's unfortunate, but it's true. So, Star Wars basically bottomed out and then kind of stopped for a while. You could argue that Tor has a part in it. I would argue against that, but let's just ignore that for a moment. Now Disney has purchased rights to Star Wars, and we once again have hope. Now, I know a lot of people have very mixed feelings about that. I try to keep my own thoughts on that to myself because I know very, very, very few people who agree with me on it. Only one other person, actually, I know personally agrees with me on this one. But I do have cautious hope about Star Wars. A new hope. Haha, sorry, I couldn't resist the pun. I do have a new hope about Star Wars. I do genuinely think, I hope, I shouldn't even say think, because it's not think. I hope that Star Wars will come back in some fashion that is actually good. Now, all of this, my God, how long am I talking now? I apologize. All of this has been built up to what I really want to talk about. And I'm going to try really hard not to actually yell or anything like that, because I am genuinely angry about this. I have been a fan of Squaresoft since Rad Racer. Most of you probably have never even heard of that game, and that's fine. I bet you've heard of the game Final Fantasy. You know, the first one, back on the NES. I bet most of you out there have at the very least seen it, or indeed could probably recognize some of the music and graphics from it, even if you've never actually played it. Because it's Final Fantasy. And say what you like, even with all the flaws and difficulties it had, I still conjecture that it was a good game. And when they made the proper remake, which fixed up all the UI and graphics and sound problems, I enjoyed it immensely. That moved it up significantly, which I think says something. That once you got rid of the problems of the technology and the times, and kept the same core game underneath, it was a much better game. Well, obviously, it was. You get my point. Is the point that it was still a great game, and that really says something, in my opinion. Now, like it or not, and you can call me a geek or a loser, whatever you'd like for this, because that is, of course, your right, but Final Fantasy has had a very large and very genuine impact on my life. Now, let me make one thing very clear. I am not a fan of Final Fantasy because it has the term Final Fantasy in it. This is something that I don't understand, and I've seen other people do. Blah is good because it says blah on the tagline. No, I am a fan of several of the Final Fantasy games. The fact that they tend to be that many of them are extremely good games is almost coincidental, if you know what I mean. It's not the fact that it's the FF series, it's the fact that each one of them lived up to that name, lived up to that expectation, lived up to that promise of being a Final Fantasy. That's different. You know, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was not a Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy Adventure, Final Fantasy Tactics, none of these games were Final Fantasies. Just because it has FF in the name doesn't make it a Final Fantasy. You see where I'm going with this? I have heard many different people with many different opinions on when Final Fantasy, and indeed when SquareEnix started to go downhill. And I have almost universally heard that it's sometime after Final Fantasy IX came out. The specifics tend to vary, and I will not be giving my own opinion because I don't want to get it. I don't want to make this into a flame war. I don't want people to be like, oh, well, he just thinks this game sucks. No. It is my opinion that that company and its general product had been going downhill for many years now. And I have to admit that I have already considered Final Fantasy Lost for several years. I've already considered that franchise dead and gone for several years now. And then a few days ago, let me actually rewind just a bit. I have this thing, I believe the trope is called the hope spot. That doesn't fully apply, but that's what I like to think of it as. It's when things are at their worst, and then you have this tiny little ray of hope, right? I tend to have this feeling in the back of my mind, this expectation. I hate to call it that, because it's not like I'm actually expecting it. This hope, I guess? This wish that at some point in time, Square will start to turn around, and all of a sudden they'll start doing good stuff again. Again, this is not something new. We have seen companies do this before. I have seen companies do this before. There have been times when companies have gone down. I mean, actually, you know what? Let me just make an absolute point here. Square themselves have done this before. Square has done, but then they've come back from it before. Obviously, for a much shorter period of time than the last several years that we've been having problems with. But it's happened before, and so I just kind of keep waiting for news from them, and I do actually check up on Square News regularly, well, semi-regularly, in order to see what's up, and every single time I hear some bit of news out of them, it's bad. Every single thing I keep hearing out of Square is bad, bad, bad. It gets so discouraging. But I keep waiting for that one bit of good news and all that. I was so excited when I heard that they were actually re-releasing Kingdom Hearts Final Mix. You know that? I was jazzed. And then I found out that they weren't releasing it here. you know, they were releasing it in the place that already had Final Mix, over there, across the pond. And the reaction I just gave is basically how it was just, I couldn't even muster the energy to be angry. It was so discouraging. Then, to continue my sentence, a few days ago I saw something called FFATB. And it is very rare that I look at a game and feel that I have been genuinely insulted by its mere existence. That I look at something and I cannot even bring myself to factor in who or what it was intended for or why. I have yet to read a single positive thing about this game. I did quite a bit of research because I couldn't believe it. I mean, I know that sounds, oh, I can't believe this. No, I seriously couldn't believe this. I genuinely felt that I was missing something. There had to be something more to this. Nope. No. Everything I read, everything I learned was just worse. I'm not going to detail it in its entirety here because, frankly, I don't want to start spitting all over my laptop. But FFATB is insulting to me as an FF fan, as a gamer, as a human being. The mere fact that they had the balls to release Final Fantasy, please give us more money, because that is what this game actually is. Make no mistake. I don't actually have words for it. I'm sorry. I really do not have words for it. This is so low that this is... I previously thought they'd already started scraping the barrel, but this is beyond anything I had ever conceived that they would have actually sunk to the level of. I cannot believe that someone greenlit this effect. And you know what really sucks about this? It's selling relatively well. It's not a bestseller or anything, but it is selling quite well. Last I checked, which was a couple days ago. Now that disgusts me on so many levels I don't even know how to put it. And let me make this clear. If you bought FFATB and for some reason enjoy it, and I honestly, I'm sorry, I mean no offense, but I have no idea how you can enjoy that game. I really don't. But if you do, I will not place judgment upon you for that. That is not my right nor my place. That is not me. The reason it disgusts me is because it sets precedent. It means that now they will look at that and see it's profitable. And that's what they'll do. Is a game that is it's not even a game. I'm sorry, I refuse to call that a game. I refuse on principle to call an interactive screensaver a game. They will look at that app and say, that's making money. And you know what they're going to do for that. And I can't even necessarily blame them for that. I mean, I'd like to. I'd like to just rant and rave and rip their heads off. But that's the emotional part of me thinking. My mind is thinking, well, they got to report to their board of directors. They have to justify themselves to their stockholders. They have to put in an earnings report that is a net profit. I understand how the corporate world works. I do. I took classes on it, for God's sakes. I got awards for accounting. I know how this works. Doesn't mean I like it. And so now I find myself in a situation where I'm about to lose, again, something I loved. I shouldn't even say about to use. It is gone. Final Fantasy, in my opinion, in my honest-to-God opinion, has gone to the point now where it is truly, officially, no really, nail in the coffin, dead. And as much as that makes me angry, it makes me more sad. That's why I called this a lamentation. It's because at the end of the day, I don't like the fact that... I know people who like to get angry about things like this. They might not admit it, some do. But they like to have something to rage about. They like to have something to rant about. They like to have that venting process for whatever reason. And again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I am not one of those people. I look at this and all I feel is disappointment and a bit of depression that a part of my life is now dead. It may come back someday. I mean, again, I feel this is why I brought the Doctor Who example up so strongly, because there is no sign whatsoever that Final Fantasy is going to have any kind of a revision. None. But there wasn't for Doctor Who either. And it took years in that one. I don't remember how many years, don't ask me. I'd have to look it up. It felt like a lot longer than it was, I'm sure. But I mean, we had versus 13. Anyone remember that? I'm not sure Square remembers that anymore, given the way that's been. No, no, no. We need to get FF14-2 out because FF14 was so bad that even they acknowledged its atrocious levels of ridiculous failure. Or how about, you know, Dragon Quest X. Dragon Quest X actually looks pretty good, despite the subscription and the insane cost of the game. But never mind that, the game itself looks good and enjoyable. Fantastic! No word whatsoever on a release outside of Japan. Anywhere. Not here in the States, not in Europe, nothing. Now, I don't know about you guys, and I know I have many viewers in Europe, so feel free to fill me in this on the comments. I don't know about how the figures work out there, but here in the States, Dragon Quest sells pretty well. I mean, it's not like the most popular thing ever, but it sells pretty well over here. Dragon Quest IX sold fantastically. So did 6. So did 5. So did 4. So did 8. I'm talking about the remakes to 4, 5, and 6, by the way. And, of course, 8 being the PS2 one. But apparently, you know, we just don't get that over here. And I could keep going on this. I really could. I have so many examples that it boggles my mind. And I need to pull back, because every single one of these is literally just me saying the same point. It's just more evidence. I could literally go down a list. I could make a list of like 20 items and say, here is the stupid decision Square has made over the last 2 years. And every single one of them is me saying the same thing over and over, even though, not literally, of course, you know, they decided this, and they decided this with this game, and they decided this with this series, and they decided to push this with this series. But every one of them is ultimately me saying the same theme. That there is no Squaresoft anymore. Any more than there's any Final Fantasy anymore. And I just wanted to get that off my chest, because I can't imagine I'm the only one sad about that. I'm going to go ahead and stretch a bit, and then start my next video.